I'm ready when you are.
Good evening, everyone. We'll just be giving a moment to let everyone join us this evening. Great. All right, I know we still have people joining, but we'll go ahead and take advantage of the time we have now. So we'll go ahead and get started with my intro. So I just want to say good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program with journalist and writer Stuart A. Reid, who's joining me in conversation about his forthcoming book, The Lumumba Plot, The Secret History of the CIA and a Cold War Assassination. It's coming out next Tuesday. I have an advanced reader copy right here. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Now, please make sure you stay tuned to our library's website, hudsonlibrary.org, so you don't miss any of our exciting upcoming events. Next week, I will be here, same time, same place, to talk with Harvard professor Avi Loeb about extraterrestrial life and aliens in his new book, Interstellar. We'll also have two new authors, including best-selling cookbook Nick Sharma, author of Vegetable, who's joining us on October 26th to talk about how you can integrate more vegetables into your cooking. And we'll also have writer and researcher Laura Norton on November 6th to discuss her forthcoming book, Lay Them to Rest, which is an overview into the world of forensic science and how to solve cold cases. So for all of those, plus many, many more, just visit our website. If you're interested in grabbing a copy of Stuart's book, pre-orders are still available courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookshop, The Learned Owl. We'll add a link to the chat for easy purchase. And also, I would love to hear your questions throughout tonight's program. Please leave any questions you may have for Stuart or about the topic using the Q&A button below, and we'll get to them towards the end. Now, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Stuart A. Reid is an executive editor of Foreign Affairs. He's also written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Bloomberg Businessweek, Political Magazine, Slate, and other publications. We are his first stop on this book tour, so we'll be easy on him tonight. And also, according to his website, he also has ties to Ohio. So thank you, Stuart, for joining us. How are you doing this evening?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for having me. And I grew up in Findlay, Ohio, so about 2 hours west of Hudson, and it's good to be back virtually.
Kind of connected. All right, so this book, this is a very, very complicated history, and I think it's a history that a lot of people are unaware of. I know when I was in school, even in college, I did not have teachers and professors talking about Lumumba, talking about the United States and their first operations between the executive branch and the CIA, State Department, essentially carrying out assassination plots. So, you know, I think there's a lot to this story. And in order to really gain the full understanding, we have to go all the way back to the history of Congo and about when it was colonized by Belgium. And can you talk a little bit about King Leopold II and what his goals were when he decided to take this land?
Sure. So in the 1870s, King Leopold II, King of Belgium, which was a relatively new country at that point, founded in 1830, he sort of went looking for a colony and thought that it was a thing that a great, impressive European power should have, like many other European powers did. And Belgium was sort of late to the game of becoming a country. And so he went looking for a colony, and he talked about how he wanted a slice of magnificent cake in Africa. And the slice he picked was the basin around the Congo River. And that he sent an emissary there and had, sent forces to sort of take over and sign treaties with the local populations there. And so what was a massive land area, it's actually the size of Western Europe, became his personal colony. And it wasn't even a colony that belonged to the Belgian state. It was his personal fiefdom, basically, and it was called the Congo Free State. And that began in about 1880. And Leopold's goal there was really one, prestige, as I mentioned. He thought this was a thing that a European country should have, and two, resource extraction. And that changed a bit over time. First ivory, and then rubber. And that was what, if people have read King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hammarskjöld, they may be familiar with that. That tells the story of Leopold's sort of genocidal reign over the Congo Free State, which was really aimed at extracting rubber through basically forced labor. So it really goes down, King Leopold's rule in Congo goes down as this sort of in the pantheon of human atrocities. And it lasted until, I mean, he died and never set foot in Congo, which is, I think, really fascinating. And eventually the colony was transferred to the Belgian government in 1920, I think, after a sort of international outrage. And then it became part of the Belgian government.
Right. And so the main subject of your book, Patrice Lumumba, he is born and raised and is a young adult during its time as Belgian government. Can you talk a little bit about what colonized life was like living in Congo at that time? I know there were obviously villages, but there were cities, and it seemed like different cities had different cultures to them.
Yeah, so Patrice Lumumba, who ends up becoming prime minister of the Congo when it becomes independent in 1960, and that's getting a little ahead of us.
Mm-hmm.
He was born in 1925 in a small village in rural Belgian Congo. And eventually, as a teenager or early 20s, moves to a city. And this was a big trend across Africa where you had the urbanization of the African population there. And so he moves to a city. The city is Stanleyville, which today is known as Kisangani. And it was really this, the Belgians styled it as this sort of oasis in the jungle. There was actually the movie The African Queen was filmed there in the 50s with Katharine Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart. And it was this, on the surface, this really placid colonial life, colonial city with the Belgians apparently firmly in control. Lumumba himself was working as a postal clerk for the Belgian administration, but he seethed privately at the racism that the colonial system was founded on. So Black people couldn't use the same restaurants. They were sent to different hospitals from the white Belgian population. They had no political rights. It was just, control and oppression. And as the 50s went on, this became sort of untenable for the Belgians.
Right. And on top of that, there's kind of almost this like educational philosophy too of the evolve, if I am correct, where there was this belief that education and maybe even also religion can change and shape somebody. Can you talk a little bit about the evolve and maybe how they also play a role in the contribution towards the building towards, the boiling point of maybe wanting to be separated?
Yeah. So the Belgian system was sort of administratively complicated. And so one of the things they had was this status called évolué, which is French for evolved person. And what that meant was if you were a Congolese man, you could apply for a card from the colonial administration that said, we formally certify that so-and-so is, an évolué and is civilized and, speaks good French, eats with a knife and fork, has a proper toilet in his house, that sort of thing. It was really this sort of intrusive investigation that went on. And Lumumba himself happily, eagerly applied for this classification and was one of the first to receive it in Congo. And so what this did was it sort of generated, there was a nascent political class in Congo. So, politics was not allowed, a lot of censorship, did not have freedom of expression, but there were these associations where like-minded Congolese who enjoyed literature, who wanted to sort of be talking about culture and having meetings with other people and had high status jobs, that sort of thing, could meet together. And what is sort of ironic about it is the Belgians ended up sort of shooting themselves in the foot from their narrow colonial perspective, because they created a more politically aware class that then, surprise, surprise, would not be interested in continuing to be ruled by faraway leaders in Europe. So Lumumba himself is a product of this évolué system. He himself was a extremely well-read person. He was an autodidact. Higher education was allowed only very late, in the late 50s or mid to late 50s in Congo. So he wasn't able to attend university, but he read voraciously and joined a library. And so he becomes politically aware and politically active as the 1950s go on.
Right. And during this time, as like you said, Belgium kind of makes this social class that they were not really intending certain consequences from. You were introducing your book to some of Lumumba's political eventual rivals and bitter rivals, let's be honest, along with some people that are at times allies and some people that are also neutral. Can you talk about these early days? And this can even lead up to the formation of like these political parties, such as like Lumumba's political party, the NMC, if I'm correct, right? The MNC, sorry,
Yep.
the Movement National Congolese. Sorry for mix that up. Can we talk a little bit about like how are these political parties being created? Like, where were the loyalty? Was it based on ethnicity? Was it more on tribalism? Was it more on religion? What were the platforms like?
Yeah. So just to back up a bit, so the broader context here is, as the 1950s go on, a few things happen. One, there's a massive riot in 1959 where the population of the capital of Congo, Leopoldville, revolts and destroys everything that is signifying Belgium. And more broadly at the time, the winds of change are sweeping through Africa. Populations are waking up, realizing that they can change their situation and become independent countries. In Algeria, the French are fighting this the Algerians are fighting an anti-colonial war against the French. The Belgians certainly don't want that. So very quickly, they had to change plans. And to give you just one detail I found interesting on this, in 1955, there was a Belgian academic who wrote a 30-year plan for Congolese independence. So he wrote this detailed plan of how by 1985, and he's writing this in 1955, the Congo would finally be ready to be an independent country. He got in trouble because that was seen as way too fast and premature, and that would, the Belgians should rule it for much longer than that. So that was telling of what their thinking was. That changed very, very quickly in the late 1950s. Meanwhile, as you alluded to, there are sort of these political groups cropping up. Belgium had sort of slowly opened the door and had some piecemeal reforms because it was recognizing that this was inevitable. It was getting pressure from other countries. It still thought it could control things and keep a lid on Congo. What were these political groups' ideologies? Most of them, as you alluded to, were ethnicity-based. What used to be called tribal, now the more correct term is ethnicity. And so, in a sense, this was natural because you have a giant country or colony that doesn't really make sense geographically. The borders were drawn in Germany and Berlin in 1880 with no regard paid to ethnic group or geography. It's an arbitrary grouping. And so many of the different ethnic groups sort of naturally thought, well, why should we have anything to do with the people halfway across the country who speak a different language and have entirely different customs and traditions than us? So most of the politicians, these emerging sort of budding politicos, were had very specific appeals to their ethnic group or their region. Lumumba was really different, and he was one of the few who was a nationalist, meaning he thought Congo should be independent, but as one single country, Congo. He also thought it should have a strong central government as opposed to others who wanted a lot of power in the dispersed towards the provinces. So that was sort of the broader picture leading up to independence and how Lumumba himself fit into it.
Right. And I think maybe now is kind of a good time to introduce him. because there are a lot of players in this game and this story. But when you're mentioning how there are different geographic areas that are more like, I care about my area, I don't necessarily care what's happening on this side of the Congo, right? The main player we need to really introduce is the province of Katanga, and that would be led right by Moise Shombe at some point. But he is also one of these political figures that is in these roundtable discussions that's occurring even before independence. Do you want to introduce him and explain what his theory was? Because they were butting heads with Lumumba way before independence even happened.
Yeah. So there are the riots in 1959. The Congolese are demanding their independence. Lumumba himself underwent this evolution where in the late 50s, he was saying things like, oh, I want to have Congo not fully independent, but sort of in partnership with Belgium, and the King of Belgium will still be, at the top ultimately. That changes very quickly. And he and the other politicians start demanding immediate independence. So what the Belgian government does is it has this roundtable session in Brussels where all the biggest Congolese political leaders are invited to Brussels, and they hash out the details of independence with the Belgian government. And that results in an agreement that, okay, on June 30th, 1960, Congo will be independent. The Belgians will no longer be in charge. At that roundtable, as you mentioned, was another politician, a man named Moise Tshombe, and he was the leader of Katanga. Now, the things you have to know about Katanga are, one, it was incredibly mineral rich. It's where all the copper came from. And in fact, it's where the uranium that was in one of the atomic bombs dropped on Japan came from. And the other thing to know about Katanga is that it was always sort of run separately from the rest of Congo. So it had a degree of separate administration and some autonomy. So naturally, Tshombe's position is, no, Lumumba, we're not going to be part of your greater Congo. We want to have our own rights. We want to keep the revenues to ourselves and not give them to virtual strangers in the capital halfway across the country. So at this roundtable problem, as you said, they butted heads. There are also bigger structural problems here. It was so rushed. I mean, at the beginning of 1960, in January 1960, most experts who followed Africa didn't think that Congo would become independent that year. Then weeks later, there's the roundtable and a date was agreed. And turns out Congo is becoming independent in 1960 after all. It was one of 17 African nations to become independent that year. And so it's incredibly rushed. What do they end up doing? They copy and paste much of the Belgian constitution into the new Congolese constitution. And so it's this haphazard process of writing a constitution, creating a system of government, a process that usually takes years, took literally weeks.
Right. And I was going to bring that up was when I read the book and I saw the timeline for developing an entire country, essentially from the ground up, right? It's your chance to make it what you want it to be. It seemed like crazy how quickly this was. And there are times in your book you're talking about the other Congo, and we haven't brought that one up yet. The neighbor, the other Congo, which is a colony from France. And they actually have independence the same year as the Belgian ruled Congo. Can you talk a little bit about how the two Congos differ from each other? And how did the trajectory for decolonization for the French ruled Congo differ from the Belgian?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. So it's a little bit confusing. There are two Congos. There's the one about that my book's about is the former Belgian Congo. That's the big one in the middle of Africa. The other Congo, also named for the Congo River, is on the other side of that river, is much, much smaller and was ruled by France. Now, it's really interesting, and it proved to be really important, how different European powers ran their colonies. So there were a lot of similarities, and they were, fundamentally engaged in the same unjust thing. But the French and the British were a little bit smarter about it. And what I mean by that is that they devolved some political power early, and they had sort of proto-legislatures. So in Senegal, for instance, you'd have, it was French West Africa. It was a French colony, but you had Senegalese legislators passing bills, and they had a certain amount of power. You even had a Senegalese representative in the French parliament in Paris. So there was a degree of representation there. There was a lot more educational links going on. So people from Nigeria and Ghana, which were both British colonies, and other French colonies, they would be studying in Paris and London and going back and forth. Belgium was completely different in the way they ran the Congo. They really hived it off. They prevented Congolese from traveling abroad. They prevented them from getting educated, as I mentioned. And so this mattered a lot, because what happened is eventually the country became independent. And so you had a political class that had not, there weren't any lawyers, because you couldn't become a lawyer as a Congolese. So you have, a bunch of people who had been prevented from having higher education. There was no practice of democracy, sort of having proto legislatures and that sort of thing. The whole thing was done on the fly and incredibly rushed. And in some ways, it shouldn't have been surprising the chaos that followed.
Right. Because speaking of rush, before you know it, we have our first election for a prime minister and a president. And I believe, if I remember correctly from your book, there were over 80 candidates.
I think that's right. Yeah.
That's insane. I don't know how I would be able to keep track of 80 different people, but I understand that, especially if people were more geographic, regional, they're going to vote for. But I remember you explaining like almost like the presidential tour, the prime minister tour that Lumumba did, because Lumumba was very active. He definitely wanted to be involved. He had a very strong feeling about wanting to have a role in this new administration. Can you talk a little bit about what a campaign was like for these early runners, and what voting was like? How was an election, and how long did that election, take place? What was it like?
Yeah, well, I should clarify. It was a parliamentary system, so it wasn't as if each voter was picking from 80 candidates, but it was, each voter was picking from, I don't know, 5, 6, 8 candidates in their particular electoral district. But your broader point definitely stands, which is that it was an incredibly chaotic experience. So elections happened in May 1960. That was something that had been agreed to at this roundtable in Belgium. And you had this very weird phenomenon of everyone running, but they had no record to run on. There was no incumbent politician, period. So people were promising everything left and right. There were all sorts of rumors about what would happen upon independence. There was this, people would say, "Oh, all the Belgians will be forced to leave." Not true. Or, some people thought that the dead would rise from their graves, and there was just no really concept among the masses, at least, about what independence would mean. So Lumumba, in this context, he's running a campaign and becomes a very formidable opponent. What really distinguished him is he was like the master political organizer. He could, enroll voters, get pamphlets printed, tour with a megaphone through the streets. He was this incredible campaigner. He barely slept. One of those people who can sort of run on no sleep. And then the other thing about him that everyone, even his bitterest enemies, would agree on was that he was extremely charismatic. He could really win people over with just a speech, and he combined elegant turns of phrases and emotional appeals with sort of logical reasoning and common sense sounding ideas. And so he was an incredible campaigner. And then his message of a united Congo, not splintering apart, but we have to be strong and united as we become an independent nation, that resonated as well.
Right. And, we aren't necessarily tonight going all into his biographical sketch, but I would highly encourage those who want to read his book. He was so charismatic, from being a postal clerk to, we're not even talking about the beer hype man stories and the polar beer. And he was able to pretty much sway like a country to like about personal preferences for which beer to drink. He was such a hype man on it. And even down to like his final escape tour, when he's been like captured and he's like in his home and he can't leave his home because there's troops outside that want to murder him. When he finally escapes, he's pretty much on this like last tour where he has to keep making all these stops everywhere to have his like own like little political speeches. It just showed like he had a lot of charisma. So I just had to
Yeah,
really,
he was addicted to campaigning and speech making for sure.
he definitely liked the limelight. So, you know, I guess we can talk about how he was a little bit different, because there was a thing that he decided to do that was different than I think many of the other people running would have done. So in this administration, there's a prime minister, but there's also a president. And he decides to pick Joseph Kasavubu. Did I say that correct? Okay, thank you. He selects Joseph Kasavubu to be the president role, if I'm correct, to run with him. Now, these two were not friends. In fact, Kasavubu during the roundtables got up and walked away, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So they were not friends. They were quite political rivals. What do you think was Lumumba's thinking in selecting someone in a rival? Because I'm trying to think here in the United States, and I can't imagine people pairing up like a political rival to be their running mate for like a presidential election. Think about that here. What do you think was his thoughts behind that? And do you think that was a fatal decision for him to do?
Yeah, so this was after the parliamentary elections and after Lumumba had been asked to form a government, as one does in a parliamentary system. He was able to choose and sway his allies to pick really a president. And the president was the head of state. The idea was that it would sort of, this person would play the role that the Belgian king played in Belgium. So you have the prime minister of Belgium, who's an elected official involved in the day-to-day stuff. And then floating above is the king of Belgium, sort of basically in a ceremonial role, not doing anything. And so this was because they copied and pasted the constitution from Belgium. This was the model that was going to happen in Congo. And Lumumba's thinking was, so Joseph Kasavubu was sort of the other big politician of that moment. He had the second most number of supporters, I think one could say. He also, however, unlike Lumumba, Kasavubu was sort of an ethnic nationalist. He wanted, his whole political platform was about his people, the Back Congo people, and protecting them and their homeland and that sort of thing. Lumumba's thinking was that it's better to have him inside the tent than outside. There was a certain logic to it. Let's bring him in, it'll be inclusive. But it really turned out to be a fatal decision after independence. And maybe I can just briefly summarize the chaos that happened upon the country becoming independent, if unless you wanted to take us elsewhere.
Oh no, I was going to say that independence was celebrated for a brief moment and then it turned bad. Let's talk about it.
That's a very accurate summary. So June 30th, country becomes independent. It's a big celebration in the capital. Everything seems to be going fine. Extremely quickly, within days, everything falls apart. What happens? One, the army mutinies. You have, as a sort of holdover of colonialism, all the officers in the army were white Belgians and the rank and file were Congolese. As you can imagine, this was not particularly popular among the rank and file. They mutiny, they disarm their officers, humiliate them, are roaming the streets, creating chaos. That happens. The Belgian government, the next thing is then a lot of the white civilians flee. So you have all the doctors, teachers, air traffic control officers, the Belgians who are sort of making daily life work, the experts, the technicians, that sort of thing, they fled en masse. It was this massive white flight. Then the Belgian military intervenes, sends in paratroopers across the country without Congolese permission. So it's essentially invading its former colony with no permission. They did that ostensibly to protect the Belgian population there, but it looked like a sort of recolonization. And then you have one and then two different provinces secede. So Katanga with Moise Tshombe, as we mentioned earlier, and then this other half of a province, basically South Kasai, ends up seceding. So the country's literally splintering. And then Lumumba he's desperate. His country's falling apart. So he calls on the United Nations to send in a peacekeeping mission. And it's the first time the UN has ever done anything like this. Before that, they had they'd been monitoring ceasefires and truces and that sort of thing. In the Congo, for the first time, they mounted this massive peacekeeping operation. And it was really this idealistic moment. You had troops from all different African countries, Ghana, Guinea, Morocco, Egypt. And then you had the Americans were helping with the airlift, the Soviets were too, and the British. So this really come together moment where even in the midst of the Cold War, all these countries were able to agree, let's try and help Congo and send in peacekeepers. And it was this, an attempt to rescue the situation. Unfortunately, it didn't work out at all.
No, it didn't. Well, everything is starting to crumble and tensions are running high because we have Belgium. Belgium is coming in. We have different areas like, Katanga says, UN, if you come into my area, we will shoot you. It immediately starts breaking down. At the same time, though, which is the big point of your story, is to also look at how the United States was acting. Because there have been other books and movies written about Lumumba, but I feel like your book is the first one to really dive deep into, dare I say, sneaky behaviors of the Eisenhower administration, the CIA, and the State Department, and the National Security Council, correct? So at what point do they start kind of having the sirens raised in the back of their minds about what's going on in Congo and Lumumba?
Yeah, so Lumumba's reached out to the UN for help. They come in. It's not working to his satisfaction. There's still chaos. The UN can't recapture the secessionist province. And so he goes to the United States in July 1960. Eisenhower's actually out of town, so he doesn't get to meet with him, to his great disappointment. And he meets with the Secretary of State at the time, Christian Herter, and he asks for American help. And the Americans basically brush him off, saying, no, we're not going to give you all this aid, and we're not going to give you a plane and other things he'd asked for. Everything has to go through the UN. So he goes back to Congo. Chaos still everywhere. It's not working. And then he makes this very fateful decision, which is to call on the Soviet Union for help. Again, the Cold War context here, the idea was, the world is divided. You're either with us or against us or on the fence, and you need to pick a side. And so Lumumba, from his perspective, he's seeing it as, I'm desperate, I need help. Americans didn't want to help me. So, okay, what about the Soviet Union? That was a naive view in retrospect, to think that he could sort of avoid the Cold War and that wouldn't anger the Americans. But that is what he thought. And one of the things that really struck me researching this is, a lot of people at the time and since have painted Lumumba as this Soviet puppet or as pro-communist. In fact, all the evidence suggests that he was much more naturally pro-American. So when he was in Washington, one of the things he did was he called on US troops to be sent to the Congo. He said, he gave a press conference in the basement of Blair House and asked for American troops to come to Congo, which is hardly the type of thing you'd expect from someone who was, on the Soviet side. So that, nevertheless, his appeal to the Soviet Union set off alarm bells within the CIA, within the Eisenhower administration, and in particular with Eisenhower himself, who at this fateful meeting in August 1960 basically ordered the CIA to try and assassinate Lumumba.
Right, because I don't know Lumumba, never met him or his family. I wasn't around then, but I'm reading the story, and it seems like he tries to appeal multiple times, not just once, because even when Eisenhower's out and Kennedy's in, he is still hopeful that there can be a change with the administration and a change in their prioritization and their willingness to help him. But it seems like just because he reaches out like once, and yes, eventually you do mention in the book that the Soviets do provide some planes. But it took multiple times for him to reach out to get anything, because for the longest time, the Soviets didn't take the Congo seriously either. They figure, what is in this for us? And if the United States, if America doesn't care, then why should we care, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of one of the tragedies of this, is that the Americans, and the CIA in particular, were deeply convinced that the Soviets were intimately interested in Congo. With the opening of the Soviet archives after the Cold War, it turns out they weren't that interested in it at all. This is 1960. They're still relatively weak. They would become more powerful later, but they didn't really have the ability to project power that far away. They had no military bases nearby. They would have to get overflight rights from countries that wouldn't say yes. There were difficulties here, and so the Americans thought, oh, the Soviets must be really interested, and they sort of interpreted everything as if Lumumba was working to further their interests. In fact, I argue, and I think it's pretty clear the evidence supports this, he was just trying to survive and put his country back together. But in the Cold War context, reaching out to the Soviets, and as you said, they did in fact start to provide a teeny bit of aid, sort of really, I'd say, token aid. And ironically, or unfortunately for Lumumba, none of that aid really reached Congo in time to make a difference. Events intervened and made it a moot point. But yeah, this was at the Cold War tensions running high. The CIA sees a leader of a country that they deemed potentially important asking Moscow for military help, threatening to kick out the UN. It seemed, okay, America's going to lose our influence here. We need to do something about it. And that's why the CIA put in motion this sort of crazy operation.
Right. And there's various characters that you talk about, including Larry Devlin and others, that their feelings, not only their professional, but also their personal feelings about individuals that they encounter in Congo, are made very clear now due to declassified cables. And I want to get your thoughts on like the different ways then the United States, other than Dwight Eisenhower thinking, well, maybe we'll just poison Lumumba, and we even have the one poisoner, Gottlieb, if I'm correct, right? Yeah, a lot of names. I'm sorry, everybody. There that he actually provides poison to Devlin, to hold on to potentially get into Lumumba's house and then poison him so that he would die. Again, this is on Eisenhower's orders. But there's a lot of other shiftiness and manipulation going on behind the scenes, not just an outright plan to hopefully kill Lumumba. Can you talk a little bit about the power of money and how the United States was using money to change and potentially cause a coup?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, there was the poisoning plot, which is, it's out of like a Cold War movie in retrospect. There's poisons flown to the Congo. Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief, was instructed to put it in Lumumba's food or toothpaste. So that's a whole, subplot or plot, as it were, of the book. But there was a lot of other stuff going on. And so one of the more consequential things was Lumumba's prime minister. He's unpopular in the West because of this outreach to the Soviets. And so in addition to the poisoning plot, there's Larry Devlin is bribing members of parliament in the hopes that there will be a vote of no confidence and Lumumba will get overthrown. And then, crucially, in September 1960, a man named Mobutu sort of steps into the situation and announces that he's taking charge and has, launched a military coup, although his words announcing it were, this is not a military coup, but it was. And Lumumba, as Devlin himself would later admit in his own memoirs, was Mobutu was paid by Devlin. So Devlin hands this military officer a suitcase of cash, and then the coup takes place a number of days later. So there was a lot of CIA money being funneled to Mobutu, and sort of the coup was just the beginning. And Mobutu sort of turned into an expert at wheedling bribes from Devlin and the CIA, saying, "Oh, I need more money. My officers are going to rebel against me tomorrow if you don't give me more cash." And so the CIA was just constantly funneling cash to Mobutu and his entourage,
Right.
and it created this whole culture of bribery and dependency, and it was a bad situation.
Yeah, and that kept going, right? Because then after Lumumba is ousted, and then they decided kind of have like this meeting where like they forced everyone into this one compound, if I'm correct. And it was to vote on like some UN protocols, if I'm correct. Remember, I'm not an expert on this, but I remember there was, again, a lot of bribery from the United States with briefcases of cash. You even worded that people were leaving with things like wrapped in bed sheets that they did not come with before. So like, where else would they have gotten that except from bribery? So it was a tactic that they quickly learned worked.
Yeah, and not only bribing the Congolese politicians, one of the things that I found that was also pretty disappointing was they were bribing, CIA was bribing members of the General Assembly at the UN. So there was this crucial vote about Congo in New York at the UN, and the CIA was dispatching satchels of cash to various countries. And you can, look at the voting records and, oh, you see suddenly this, Mexico switched its vote from day 1 to day 10. What could have explained that? So the bribery was really extensive, and it was one of the preferred tools for the CIA's policy in Congo.
Right. One of your large theses in your book is, we're not, we are skipping a little bit ahead. We will, come back to Lumumba's unfortunate capture and imprisonment and assassination in a bit. But you argue in your book that this was the blueprint, that this was the successful plan that essentially worked, and that the United States could use again and again and again against foreign enemies or other people that they want to get rid of. Can you talk a little bit about that and any like ramifications? Were there ramifications for any of the members of the CIA or the State Department or the Eisenhower administration after everything was said and done?
Yeah, well, they internally in the US government, the CIA's Operation Congo was viewed as a smashing success. And in narrow Cold War terms, this was true. You got rid of a prime minister who was seen as potentially pro-Soviet and not reliable and erratic, and you installed a friendly pro-American dictator. What was there not to like about that? Of course, only in the narrowest Cold War logic is that a good thing. The Congolese people suffered greatly. Mobutu himself, who, spoiler alert, led the country until 1997, so over 30 years, turned out to be not this pliant pro-American dictator, and caused all sorts of problems. And but the CIA viewed it as a success, and so, not surprisingly, you have the Bay of Pigs operation in Cuba in early 1961, at the beginning of the Kennedy administration, where the CIA has this harebrained scheme to invade the country and overthrow Castro. It fails utterly. Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, is sort of forced out after that. So in a way, there was a consequence for that. But Larry Devlin himself was, earned an award for his work in Congo. He was promoted. It was seen as a success. The missing factor from that calculation, of course, was the Congolese people, who were saddled with this dictator who was unrepresentative and terrible and corrupt, and they had lost a very popular politician.
Right, because Lumumba was definitely a populist when it comes to the people and how he connected with the people. And leading up to his ousting, between Kasavubu, United States money, there was a lot going on between the United States and Mobutu about, get rid of him, assassinate him, briefcases of cash. Eventually, they say, okay, we're doing this. And there is a capture and imprisonment of Lumumba. And I had a really hard time reading that part of the book because I felt like it wasn't just a capture anymore. It was legit torture. Can you, from like your research about this, at this point, why? Because I had a hard time, and maybe other people in the audience will have questions about this. They're accusing him at this point of genocide and all of these like really heinous crimes that he himself never pointed and said to commit. And they're using that kind of as the excuse for how they're treating him and abusing him and torturing him and burning him and all these other things they're doing to him. Can you kind of talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah. So Lumumba was only in power 2.5 months, which is an extremely short period of time, obviously. So September 1960, September 14th, he's ousted in a coup by Mobutu. But during his time in office, he dealt with all sorts of chaos and really lost the confidence of a lot of the other political actors. He sort of remained popular among the nation, but he had aggravated many, many people. One of the things you alluded to, he was accused of genocide. What that refers to is there was this one of the secessionist provinces, not Katanga, the other one, South Kasai. There was a military operation to retake that, and that went poorly and involved all sorts of massacres of civilians. There was an ethnic dimension to it too, too complicated to discuss here. But so he had sort of was flailing about. I think that's a fair way of putting it, and become deeply unpopular among his political rivals, essentially, and people who used to be on his side. So Mobutu, one of the things we haven't talked about, Mobutu and Lumumba were friends and allies, and Mobutu was Lumumba's protege and errand boy, essentially. And then they have this dramatic split, and as you mentioned, Lumumba's thrown under house arrest. He then tries to escape that. He's captured. Mobutu throws him in a military jail, and then that's sort of the beginning of the end for him.
Right. And I won't go into all the details tonight, just in case people don't want to hear, but his final assassination, when he is pulled from the prison randomly one day with two people that was part of his cabinet, and then they're just driven to Katanga, so that way it can be done ethically or whatever you want to call it. It was very hard. And I just want to say, like, this is just an aside, your passage about him, that biographical passage right in the book, right before he is assassinated, about what he meant to the different personas of Lumumba, was just beautifully written. I know you know the passage I'm talking about. But what I want to talk about after that is just the disgusting and heinous treatment of Lumumba's body afterwards. And then we'll kind of go into like then why you wrote the book and some audience questions, because a lot of people didn't know about Lumumba. I didn't learn about this in school or college. We talked about this beforehand, but it was in the news a lot in the last couple of years when a random one tooth was confiscated in Belgium and returned to his family. Can we talk about why the people who assassinated Lumumba decided to take it as far as they did, to completely dismember, remove his body, but then keep keepsakes to take back?
Yeah, I mean, it was a hard part to write too, because it's just so disgusting what happened, and really this was the end result of a long process of dehumanization for him. And so he was killed. I won't go into the gory details, but there's a Belgian police commissioner in Katanga, that breakaway province, which is where Lumumba meets his end. And he was charged with, he was instructed to get rid of the body. There didn't want to be any evidence. I think the ideal was that no one would ever know exactly what happened to him. And there was this cover story about how he had been, he had run away and was shot by villagers. So it was just, they wanted to leave it this big question mark. And so in disposing of the body, however, this Belgian man took some sort of gruesome keepsakes, one of which was Lumumba's tooth. And he took this back to Belgium. He paraded it before TV cameras for an interview. And then after his death, his daughter still had it, and she did the same for another interview. And at that point, the Belgian government, which was doing this criminal investigation into which Belgians might be responsible for Lumumba's death, seized the tooth as evidence. And in a sort of, I wouldn't call it a happy ending to the story, but last year in 2022, the tooth was returned to Lumumba's family and returned to Congo. And so it's now in a mausoleum in the capital. And, you know, Lumumba's family, and I've met some of them, they were, you know, pleased to finally have at least some part of their father whose body had been, you know, otherwise made to disappear. And so, you know, I closed the book by talking about this repatriation of his, the only thing that remains of him.
I know there was a lot of worry too about him becoming a martyr because he was so popular. And even nevertheless, his death caused a lot of political unrest. It wasn't the calm that I think some people thought it would be, which would be very naive to think. In fact, there were lots of people who supported Lumumba that then started their own revolutions. And it was a time of political upheaval even after his death.
Yeah. So what is called the Congo crisis, which began with the chaos right after independence, only ended in 1965, really. And, you know, Lumumba had been killed, but his supporters lived on and rose up against Mobutu, and only really with the help of the CIA and the biggest paramilitary operation at that point, only with their help was Mobutu able to sort of put down the rebellions and stay in power.
Right. So I have a couple questions about you personally and your experiences writing this book. And for anyone watching tonight, I know we have a few questions already, and we got about 5 questions. We'll get to those. Don't worry. Because I do want to set the scene. This was such a well-researched book. This is your first book, correct?
It is, yes.
This is well-researched. First, how long did this take to write? This is so much research in this.
Too long. I mean, I started it really in 2019, and I was 2 years late delivering my manuscript. So it's been in the works for 5 years now, almost.
Right. And I know because, you are an editor at Foreign Affair, that you are very well versed in foreign policy and things like that. But what specifically drew you to this story of Lumumba? What was special about it than other stories that you wanted to capture?
So it really began when I had the chance to go to Congo in 2014, and that made me start reading up about the country's history. And the more I read, the more it struck me that there was this amazing story here. I had never known about Congo and its independence, but if you look at copies of the New York Times from the summer of 1960, it's front page news, big headlines every day, the Congo crisis. And so I thought, what is this massive Cold War crisis that I've basically never heard of? And then what also drew me to the story were the characters. That you have Lumumba's this fascinating character, by no means a saint, aggravated lots of people, had strengths and weaknesses, and was extremely complicated. Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the UN, who ends up dying in this mysterious plane crash. We haven't even talked about that. He was fascinating. Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief. So I could go on, but it was really at a certain point I realized the story just could almost write itself.
There are a lot of really unique people that are memorable. And I know I didn't even bring up Doug because I didn't want to necessarily go down conspiracy theory alley, because just his Wikipedia alone, the whole death section and how many investigations there's been about his death, and they're still pretty much doing them. Because there's just so many theories about why he died. For those of you who don't know in the audience today, he died on his way to the Congo on a plane crash for kind of like a peace talk. And he didn't make it. And so the theory is, well, did someone shoot his plane down, or did the plane crash for natural causes? So we won't go into all that tonight, but there's a lot about that if you don't know. So, one of the things I actually really respect from your book is you have so many sources. You have sources from obviously US cables, our documentation, but you also have Belgian documentation, things from the UN. But I really appreciate that you do really put in the work for the Congolese story. Can you talk a little bit about your trips to Africa, how you were able to get those types of stories, and also about meeting Lumumba's heirs?
Yeah. So one of the problems that I faced when I started this was that any good history is based on archival documents. But in this case, there weren't any really surviving Congolese documents. There was so much chaos after independence that they're all lost, destroyed, no one knows. So the documents I was looking at, I had great sources on the American side, CIA cables, State Department reports. I had good sources on the Belgian side, they were very good record keepers, and the United Nations too. But the Congolese side was sort of this hole. So the way I filled that was a few different ways. One, there were a lot of the Congolese players wrote memoirs eventually in the 60s and 70s. And so, I tracked these down from obscure French used book websites and that sort of thing. They also gave some oral histories that were recorded at the time. There were news reports. And then, as you mentioned, I traveled to Congo multiple times for the book, and was able to interview Lumumba's daughter, Juliana, his son, Francois. And so, they were very young at the time and would not be useful sources for, the political intrigue of the day, but they could tell me, what was your father like? What do you remember about him? What did you like? What did you do when you played together? And then also sort of from your perspective, there was this massive event when soldiers were surrounding your father's house. Like, what do you remember about that? And, Juliana would tell me about playing on the balcony and looking out and seeing soldiers. So I was really able to fill in a lot of the detail through other ways. And the goal, I hope, is to really bring the Congolese side back in, because, it was a story that happened to them and that they were also involved in and had agency. And so I wanted to, give the full picture.
Right. I mean, it's a story that's completely affected them. It's still affected them to this day. One can argue that they've never really had true peace still, right? And it's,
Yeah.
It's been over 60 years. So, well, Catherine was, let's see, in the Q&A, Catherine, I guess we got her too excited about it. She wants your opinion, if possible, on Dag Hammarskjöld's death. So that is our UN representative who has the mysterious plane crash. Do you want to briefly give your opinion on it?
Sure. So there are whole books written about this, and my book is not about this. I talk about it for, a page or two, but I am pretty skeptical towards the conspiracy theories. And there are a lot of conspiracy theories, and they sort of are mutually exclusive. The main problem they have is there isn't a clear motive of who wanted Dag Hammarskjöld dead. He was flying to negotiate a ceasefire. So it would be like, Hitler or the Nazis assassinating Neville Chamberlain on the way to the Munich conference in 1938, where he was, doing appeasement and that sort of thing. It doesn't make sense. There's no motive. The other thing is, in 1961, planes crashed all the time. We take it for granted today, but this was a regular feature of life, plane crashes. And, the most likely cause was a pilot error. This was how most planes went down in 1961. And Occam's razor says that the simplest explanation is the most likely. And I think that applies here. But I also admit that, at a certain point now, it's 62 years later, it's really unknowable. And we'll never definitively get an answer to what exactly happened. So that's my take. But there, a lot of people disagree with me on that.
And there's a lot of books, he's right. And even like TV shows and all kinds of media dedicated if you want to know more about that. He was a very interesting character just in general, reading about him and his lifestyle, and his poetry. He was interesting all around. Tamara wants to let you know that up until now, she was unaware of all of these issues in Congo or with Lumumba. And she says it seems the US refused to actually listen to the problems being experienced. She asked about how much of this was related to the Cold War, and I think that was truth. But another thing you do talk about in your book is that there was some racial bias at play here too, because we have to think about the time as well, right?
Yeah, so definitely Cold War context is important, and that caused a lot of paranoia on the American side, and I'm sure on the Soviet side as well. And so every error that Lumumba made, or every action he took, was interpreted as, somehow related to the big geopolitical rivalry at the time. Of course, he didn't really care about that and was just trying to keep his country apart. Racism, I think, definitely played a role. The main effect it had was Congo was sort of, one, it was written off as a place where violent things happened. And so the United States could sort of turn a blind eye to, people getting tortured, as happened with Lumumba. And, it was a place where assassination was not a unthinkable way of solving a problem. I mean, you could never imagine the CIA at that time launching an assassination operation against, a white enemy leader. I just can't picture it. And then also it created this sense that the Congolese and other Africans were sort of political children who had to be tutored and couldn't be trusted to take care of their own affairs. So there was this really, the Belgians had this paternalistic attitude toward their subjects in Congo. And I think the Americans and other Western countries sort of had their own version of this, which was that, of course, the US has to meddle here and control things and bribe politicians because they can't be in charge themselves. They're not responsible enough. And you see that again and again in the cables and people's letters, that sort of thing. It really stood out.
Right. So I just want to say thank you so much, Stuart, for joining us tonight. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I have to tell you, anybody in the audience tonight, seriously, get yourself a copy of the Lumumba Plot. You can get it from the Learned Owl. You can borrow it from the library. We have copies, but we will when it comes out. It's a fascinating look not only at this history, but also at the time period too. There's some interesting tidbits about Louis Armstrong. We were talking about that beforehand, stuff like that. So Stuart, before we go, can you just tell us how can we follow you?
Sure. I'm on Twitter, or X as it's now known, at Stuart A. Reid. Also, my website is stuartareid.com, so you can find me there. But thanks so much for having me. It's super fun to be back in Ohio virtually, even if not in person.
Yeah.
And it was great talking to you about the book. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. If you're interested in following Stuart, like I said, he writes for various news publications and you want to keep up with his work. He just told you how. So again, thank you so much. And everyone have a great night. Good night, Stuart.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.